The UN Security Council has concluded an emergency session on the use of chemical weapons in Syria. Let's now cross live to RT's Samira Khan in the States for us. Samira, thanks for being with us. Could you tell us what was said at the UN headquarters in New York?
Well, the U.S. accused the Syrian government of using chemical weapons, while Russia highlighted that there is no solid evidence to substantiate any of these claims. Well, the two sides had a pretty heated exchange.
Earlier this week, we received yet another report that the Assad regime has used chlorine gas against its own people.
The timing of the announcement was very fortunately chosen around the time of the meeting in Paris in the upcoming Syrian National Dialogue Congress. Such a striking coincidence. The US and UK envoys have rushed to accuse the Syrian government before receiving any evidence and without waiting for the investigation to finish.
Russia has the audacity to lecture this Security Council about how to stop the use of chemical weapons.
We were the strongest advocates for an investigation, a professional investigation, not an imitation.
Russia is complicit in the Assad regime's atrocities.
Some countries are still trying to force the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to put the blame on Damascus. They do not understand that in doing so, they are undermining the authority of this respected organization.
This came after Secretary Tillerson accused Assad of perpetrating a chemical attack that supposedly happened on Monday. Let's take a quick look.
Whoever conducted the attacks, Russia ultimately bears responsibility for the victims in East Ghouta and countless other Syrians targeted with chemical weapons since Russia became involved in Syria.
Well, the problem is it hasn't even been confirmed that attacks even happened, let alone who's responsible. And there are only two sources saying this, and both are notoriously pro-rebel. Number one, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is comprised of one person based in the UK. Number two, the White Helmets. So it's safe to say that the U.S. is ascribing blame based solely on online sources. And the OPCW takes months to conduct a thorough investigation. So how was the U.S. able to gather all of this information just one day after the alleged attack? But going back to Secretary Tillerson's statement, he also said that Russia would bear ultimate responsibility, which doesn't make any sense considering Russia, China, and Bolivia have put forth draft resolution after draft resolution to look into the attacks, all of which the U.S. voted against. And of course, this fact is conveniently left out of the narrative. But this whole blame Russia game continued at the Security Council, and it seemed Nikki Haley's statements were more about Russia than anything else. But at the meeting, Russia said that the joint investigative mechanism became a political tool and called for an impartial investigation into all cases of chemical weapons use in Syria, including the joint investigative mechanism's new reports. But even though several other member states supported the proposal of a new impartial investigation, the U.S. rejected it, saying that it's ready to bring back the old joint investigative mechanism, but, quote, all other suggestions are unacceptable.
We're not going to accept any Russian proposal that undermines our ability to get to the truth, or that politicizes what must be an independent and impartial investigation.
The fact that the US dismissed our proposal right from the start reveals the truth, that they do not need an impartial investigative mechanism.
What's interesting is that these chemical attacks allegedly happened right before the meeting in Vienna and the Sochi summit on the Syrian crisis that's set to take place in only a few days. So the timing of all this is pretty fishy, to say the very least.
All right, RT, Samira Khan, we know as this story develops, you'll stay across it for us there from the United States perspective. Thanks for being with us. For more on this, we can now cross live to Rick Sterling from the Syria Solidarity Movement. Rick, thanks, as always, for being with us here on RT International. So, Russia, they say that a new probe needs to be carried out with experts actually traveling to the site of the chemical attacks in Syria. This did not happen previously. So that just seems like common sense in terms of an investigation. Why would anyone object to that?
Well, they would object to it if they are not really interested in finding out the reality or the truth of the matter. For example, in April, in Khan Sheikhoun, the investigation team never actually went to the site of the incident, and they issued their findings from abroad. And we see a jumping to the conclusion here right off the bat from the U.S. and its allies, who we may remember dubbed themselves the, quote, Friends of Syria in 2012, just as they were supplying the armed opposition with weapons and communications equipment and endless amounts of propaganda and media support. So it's suspicious that this is exactly what's going on now, but if one wants to find the truth, it will take a serious investigation, not a snap judgment as is happening here.
Well, Nikki Haley said that during the UN session, the facts come back over and over again that the Assad regime continues to use chemical weapons against his own people. Is there really any proof of that?
No, the facts that came out regarding the famous incident in outer Damascus in 2013 ultimately showed that the atrocity was carried out by one of the opposition groups with support from Turkey. So the facts actually, the quick accusations against the Syrian government there were later on found to be false. And numerous investigators, including the American Seymour Hersh, came to that conclusion that it was not from the Syrian government. So when serious investigations are done, which does take time, which takes on the ground, examination of the facts, not just relying on the agents who are actually paid by the West. The facts have shown that in past cases, it's been the armed opposition. They have a motive for doing this, of course, which is to drag the U.S. and NATO into the conflict.
Do you think that this long-running blame game over the chemical weapons and the investigation there is holding back the overall peace process in Syria?
Oh, absolutely. And it's also interesting what Samira was saying about this, the timing being interesting, because we've seen that in the past. A day or two before Geneva negotiations would start, there would be some claim of an atrocity. And that again is what we're seeing happen here. So it's really sad. It looks like there's a possibility of ending the conflict in Syria, but evidently there's some forces that just want to prolong it and keep it going. It's really sad. And just one final point. It's pretty stunning hypocrisy to hear the moralizing from the United States, which actually is the only country to have used nuclear weapons in World War II, that used massive amounts of chemical weapons in Vietnam and massive amounts of depleted uranium in Iraq. So the country that's used chemical weapons to the greatest extent among all countries is in no position to be moralizing here.
Well, continuing with this blame game idea, the U.S. Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, he claims that Russia actually bears the ultimate responsibility for all chemical incidents in Syria, specifically because of its military role there. How logical is that statement?
Well, I would kind of reverse it, and I would say that the United States bears responsibility for the conflict in Syria to the extent that the United States and its allies, France, the UK, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the whole group of them, it's open information. This is public knowledge that they've been supplying weapons, communications equipment, all sorts of support, including propagandistic and information support to the armed opposition. That's a clear violation of international law and the UN Charter.
Now, do you think other world powers share Russia's concerns over the way the chemical probe in Syria has been conducted so far?
Well, we'll see. It's the Security Council is clearly split along the lines that we've seen in the past with the West and its allies, which almost all of whom were in the so-called Friends of Syria, cynically named. And then on the other side, you've got other countries which are, we can say they're defending Damascus, but what they're really speaking out in support of is international law, which is supposed to prohibit countries from intervening in the internal affairs of other countries and making threats and funding an armed opposition.
All right, Rick Sterling from the Syria Solidarity Movement. Always interesting to hear your thoughts. Always interesting to talk to you, sir. Thanks for helping us get our heads wrapped around this one.